We're going to officially welcome all of you to our Regional Leadership Network meeting. This happens to be the last meeting of the year. That's really hard to believe, but we just want to thank you for taking time to join us this morning. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Barb for some brief introductions.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie, and good morning, everyone. We're so glad you carved out time to join us today. I wanted to share with you the agenda for this morning. I'm going to go over our virtual norms, and I want to share with you on one of the slides some of our session resources. Then we will hear from Doug Reeves, who is the author of our book. We're going to have an opportunity to network with one another. And finally, we will be asking you to please fill out the exit ticket. So as I said, we wanted to go over the virtual norms with each of you. And so if you would kindly place your name and organization. Remember, one person talks at a time. Keep your device muted unless, of course, you're speaking. We really encourage you to turn your cameras on and engage in the session. And then as you have questions, if you would kindly just type the questions in the chat as they arise. And you might want to utilize the raise your hand feature. And most importantly, display patience and presume positive intent. And we will have a great session as we have had for the last three. Okay, so then moving forward, I wanted to share with you, these are our session resources. In the middle, you will see a processing map. This is brain friendly. You can capture some of those salient points. Of course, the book that we have been studying, Achieving Equity and Excellence. And we also have linked to the live binders. And Colleen, I believe, or Tyler is putting the links to each of these resources in the chat. I feel like I have marbles or something in my mouth this morning, so I apologize, you guys. Okay, so now I would like to turn it over to Susan, who will introduce our illustrious speaker. Susan.
Thanks, Barb, and good morning, everyone. On this beautiful spring morning, I feel like it smells like spring and it sounds like spring and it really feels like spring. So I'm really excited about that. So I want to welcome Dr. Reeves with us again this morning for our last Regional Leadership Network this year as we conclude our conversation around the key practices. And we really think this is an opportunity for you all, our leaders, to again, determine how are you going to continue this work in your district. And in thinking for next year, as you're writing your one plan, some of you, how will you again lead these efforts and make these changes in your district? So again, we welcome Dr. Reeves. Thank you. We appreciate your insight that you will share with us today.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be back with you again. First of all, I think we stopped the recording. So if you want to start the recording again so that the people who are not here will have access to it, I want you to invite. Are we recording? Oh, I guess we are. Okay, sorry about that. I've learned to ask permission before I do that.
Clear is kind of like it, Dr. Reeves.
No problem. I want to express my thanks to Susan and the SST, not only for this great series and the opportunity to be with you in a very challenging year, but also for your guidance on and feedback on what we've done so far. So let me kind of lay the groundwork out for what we're going to accomplish today. One of the things that Susan, I think, so thoughtfully said was we need to move from why to how. That is, what specifically can you do as leaders in order to get these ideas in achieving equity and excellence implemented? And so one of the things that I think, if I could encapsulate in a single phrase, the whole book is about, and your role as leaders is all about, is moving from effects to causes. That is, from what Larry Lazat used to call lagging indicators to leading indicators. So what I want to start our discussion this morning with is a minute of think time and ask you to articulate in the chat room, and then I'm going to, if you're willing to, unmute yourself in about 60 seconds. Tell me the sort of indicators that you want to measure that are not test scores, that are not, percent proficient, that are not what you see in the state test, but rather the leading indicators, that is, specific actions by teachers and leaders that you can observe and monitor that will lead to the results that you want to achieve. So in the next 60 seconds, what I'm going to ask you to share is, what is an example of a leading indicator, an action of teachers or leaders that you can observe and measure? I'll see you back here in 60 seconds. And back to large group, please, in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So please, either in the chat room, or if you're willing to, unmute yourself and share with me an example of a leading indicator. That is something that you can observe in teaching or leadership that will lead to the impacts on student achievement that you want to see. Who's willing to start? And I'm going to need our SST host to help me watch the chat room, please.
Yes, we do have a couple in the chat room. One from, and feel free to unmute anyone else who wants to share out. But we have better, more structured PLC process within our district.
Yeah, so let's take that first one really seriously. And I'm going to start, and then I'm going to ask the author of that to unmute yourself and expand on it. Everybody in Ohio does some form of teacher-based teams, whether they call them PLCs or collaborative teams or TBTs, the label doesn't matter. But what I have seen is a wide variety in terms of the effectiveness of those. So one of the things that in terms of monitoring those, these are the leading indicators, remember, I want you to think about. What do teachers and leaders do? It is, to what extent do those collaborative teams actually engage in the business of observing teaching and learning and assessment, intervention and enrichment. So one of the things that I think you can do is, instead of the old forms that ODE used to make us fill out 5 years ago, instead just get a 4-line email that talks about, did we talk about learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment? And you can literally count those and see the extent to which those leading indicators are associated with improvements in student achievement. But if the author of that comment would unmute yourself, I would really like to learn more from you, please.
Yes, that was me. My name is Brian Boffman. I am a curriculum director at West Holmes. We're actually going through a strategic planning process this spring. So it's kind of nice to get this as a background before we're going on to it. But as far as our PLC process, it's really sort of hit and miss. I think we have teacher-based teams in all of our buildings that consistently meet with each other. But the process or what's going on in those team meetings varies widely by team, by building. Same idea with some of our BLT meetings. They just kind of vary widely, and we really have no district leadership team. So it's very informal process, which I understand is not necessarily bad, but we don't really have any way of monitoring the effectiveness of it, I guess. So
yeah, so thank you first of all for your honesty. I really appreciate that candor. Also, I just dropped into the chat room the article that Rick Dufour and I wrote about the futility of PLC light. That may be helpful for everybody in terms of distinguishing what PLC light really means versus getting it right. I'm doing a free webinar on that very subject later on today, but that paper may help you. Here's the frustration, and that is when people say, oh my God, you want me to tell you everything I'm doing in the PLC, and they spend all their time writing out forms instead of telling you as my leader, what did I actually do? That's why I think the reasoned middle ground is neither the multi-page form nor the converse, which is zero accountability, but a 4-line email. The 4-line email corresponds to the PLC questions: learning, assessment, intervention, enrichment. And if I could just get a 4-line email on those things, that would let me know what I'm supposed to be doing. So I think that may be a reasoned middle ground. What else do you see in the chat room, colleagues?
Well, we had somebody put in use of explicit instruction for power standards.
And please say more about that so that I can understand your intent.
That was me. That's Joe from SST9. So good morning. I'd like, when we talked earlier and Susan had mentioned about getting away from computers in front of the screen. I know what that's like when students, when as teachers, we just did a thing about fire extinguishers and we had to do the training online. And it's so much like what kids are doing online that it just, it bores you to tears. And with explicit instruction, they will get the necessary background information, so there's no gap in knowledge. They will move forward, they will practice, they can get up and move, you can put it on the board, you can change the seating. So I think it's really important if everybody did for you suggested 100 days of explicit instruction in their department, in their field, that would be painless and it would be over with. And then every time you get a new group, they'll already know it, so you can expand on it even more. So that's my thought.
Thank you. And as you thoughtfully suggest, you would never be able to do that if you tried to do that with every single standard. You've got to focus on what's most important. And by the way, this is an ideal time of year for us to think about planning for the next year. And that means if I'm teaching third grade, let's have a conversation with fourth grade teachers. And by the way, that's especially important for the transitional grades. If I'm teaching fifth grade, what do I need to do to launch them to middle school? If I'm teaching eighth grade, what do I need to do to launch them to ninth grade? And the answer, as you thoughtfully suggest, is not frantically covering every Ohio standard. It's what's most important between now and the end of the year to get them ready for next year. And that's a two-way street, by the way. Ninth grade teachers, high school, buy eighth grade teachers some pizza. By God, we need it. Take those middle school teachers out to lunch and have an honest conversation about what we as middle school teachers need to do to send them to you in high school.
Okay.
And keep going.
Go ahead.
No, I need your help to watch the chat room. Thank you.
Yep. So Trisha writes, use of explicit instruction. I'm sorry. Trisha writes, teachers conferencing with students to set goals and to provide feedback.
And that's really interesting. Would you please elaborate on how and coach me if I were a new administrator, how would I observe if that's really effective, and how would I make sure that everybody's doing that?
Well, monitoring it is always a challenge. You have to be in the classrooms frequently, doing teacher round or educational rounds, instructional rounds. But basically, when I walk into some classrooms, especially as MAP testing is just finishing up, I will see some classroom teachers sitting with those students, talking with them about their growth from fall to winter, and then setting goals from winter to spring. What are some areas that need to be areas of strength and areas for improvement, and then setting goals for how those things, how the students specifically can work between those two testing periods to grow. So that's it from a screener standpoint. And then the effect can be looked at in terms of, did they meet their growth goal on the spring assessment?
Yeah, I really appreciate the clarity that you're bringing to this, and the way that you linked a leading indicator. Are we having the conferences to the lagging indicator? What are the actual growth goals, or the growth demonstrated in student achievement? This may seem overly pedantic, but honestly, one of the things we got to look at is what percentage of kids actually do that, because some kids set goals and others don't. I've worked, for example, in schools where they were so serious about student goal setting, as you've articulated it, that they put every single one of them behind glass in the hallway. Every single student had a goal. And that's not easy to do in a large school, but I think it's really important if we take it seriously. It's not hit or miss, it's 100%. So thank you. That's a really thoughtful observation. Who's next?
That's all we have in the chat. Is there anyone else that wants to share out?
Okay, so I don't want to stop the conversation, but I'm also mindful of our time, and I want to keep us on track. Susan was so helpful in giving me really clear support on the sort of things that you needed. And the next one will surprise you because we've been so overwhelmed over the last couple of years of things to do. And I know in the book that you read, and I'm honored beyond belief that you were willing to take time to read Achieving Equity and Excellence. I know that I identified those core competencies, all the things that you ought to do, nonfiction writing, collaborative scoring, and so on. But one of the things that the SST wisely says is, wait a minute, what are we going to stop doing? And so I'm going to ask you in the next, again, I'm going to give you just a very short 60-second, 1-minute challenge to identify what's on the not to do list. That is, in order to do these things that you read about in the book, and that I know you learned in these discussions together, the only way you'll have time for that is not a 35-hour day. The only way you have time for that is to identify what to stop doing. So bear with me for just a couple of minutes of explanation, and then I'm going to give you your minute of think time that I promised you. There's a new book coming out next month, and I realized that I used to accuse Michael Fullen of writing a book after every meal. He is certainly more prolific than I am, but I write one at least once a year. And the new one coming out next month is all about implementation. And one of the things that John Hattie and I learned in the course of writing this book is this idea of de-implementation. That is, what do you stop doing before you start doing something else? So for example, one of the reasons I'm a little disheveled this morning is that I just came here from physical therapy at Mass General Hospital after having a knee replacement. So I've learned a few things about medical science in the last few weeks. And one of them is you can't start something new until you stop doing something else. You can't have a new pharmaceutical regime until you stop the previous one. You can't have a new surgical regime until you stop the previous one. The same is true, Hattie and I learned, in the course of education. You can't start all these new things. And I know one of your colleagues mentioned you're involved in strategic planning. Seriously, don't start a new strategic plan unless you're willing to say, here's what we're going to stop doing before we do the new strategic plan. And so de-implementation is a real key idea. So I'll just give you a couple of ideas, and then I'm going to give you the minute of think time I promised. For example, the best single nonfiction book I have read of the last several years is called Stolen Focus. Stolen Focus, the author is Hari, H-A-R-I. And it's all about how we are slaves to our machines. If you want to have an example of what to stop doing, you would stop responding to every text, email, and call in 30 seconds and start giving yourself concentrated think time to focus on a few things. That's true for you as leaders. It's true for teachers. It's especially true of students, because all of today's students have been raised on computers and they don't know what it's like to have 45 minutes of concentrated human time. So that's one example of what to stop doing. Another example of what to stop doing are the way that we conduct staff meetings, which is oral announcements. You can stop that and use those for real time, real opportunities to get things done. So in the next 60 seconds, what I want you to do is not talk about what you're going to do, but what you're going to stop doing. So take 60 seconds. We'll see you back here in 1 minute. Be ready to report to your colleagues about just one or two things that you're willing to stop doing before you start planning for next year. See you here in 1 minute. And back to large group in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Again, I'll need help looking at the chat room to tell me what we can stop doing.
So Dr. Reeves, I'll speak up. This is Julie Wyant from State Support Team 9. And the one thing that we try to coach districts around is to really conduct an initiative audit, because sometimes we don't even realize that we are trying to initiate 100 different things at one time. So, one of our first steps might be to do an audit so you can really evaluate what your initiatives are, and then clearly take off what's not aligned to the goals of your district at the time.
Thank you. And one of the things that you might have noticed when I talked about initiative fatigue in the book is that you got to ask teachers too, because teachers will always have more initiatives than the administrators think that they have. And that's because, and particularly this is important in Ohio, we've had such administrative turnover that the teachers perceive not only the administrators' initiatives, but their predecessor and their predecessor and their predecessors. So it's really important to dig deep into that. Thank you. That's a really thoughtful observation. Who's next?
Please feel free for anyone to unmute if you'd like. I was going to put, I think too often we try to implement change too quickly or in a haphazard fashion. And so we need to stop doing that and look to a little bit more strategic on implementing change over a course of time. And we'll also look to how do you want to scale that over the course of time with your human capital that you have, instead of just trying to do general PD for everyone that sometimes doesn't stick.
Yeah, we're that's such a thoughtful point that you're making. We are so good at starting things, not so good at stopping other things. And before we started, when we were just chatting before this session started, I made a brief reference to the sunk cost fallacy, and props to Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who really articulated that. The sunk cost fallacy is, well, gee, I spent all this money in March of 2020 when COVID started in technology, and I bought this 3-year computer program. I can't stop it now because I already spent the money. Yes, you can stop it. You can stop it, because a lot of things that were done in March of 2020 were done in a panic. They didn't make sense. That's nobody's fault. That doesn't mean that you or your colleagues made a bad choice. You did the best you can when the world was falling apart 2 years ago. But now is the time in March of 2022 to say, forget about it. Let's stop that. Let's start doing this. A really good example that we were talking about before the today's program started is classroom computer use. Yes, we all sent books home. Yes, we all sent the although whether it was a Chromebook or iPad or anything else. But now the kids are back with us. Now we have the opportunity to have real human conversation, and we've got to be willing to stop insisting that all that money that we spent has to be used 6 hours a day with those kids. So let's keep going. I know this is a hard question, but what are you willing to stop doing? I think the SST very wisely, coached me to push on this, to say, what are you willing to stop doing, not just new things? So who's next?
Dr. Reeves, I'll just expand on what you just said about the computer use, because I think oftentimes students are also taking all of their assessments on the computer. And so, those give a really nice printout of what was right and what was wrong. But I think it complicates things. Like Brian said, we want our PLCs to come back and we want to discuss our assessments. But when we're not seeing our students really write out their math problems, or really what they're writing and their real work on paper, I think that, like I said, I think it complicates it. I think it takes that element out of the PLC to really be connecting with what our students are doing, and really have that conversation on, well, what did they do well, and what did you do to help them do that, and really where they are. So I think that goes along hand on hand with learning through it and assessing through it.
Susan just inspired me to put in the chat room the wonderful book by Sherry Turkle called Reclaiming Conversation. She is a professor, and I can literally see her office outside my window right now, across the river. And what Professor Turkle does is she wrote this amazing book, Reclaiming Conversation, about the value of human time, face-to-face time. And the only reason I'm bragging about being able to look across the river at her office is that she teaches at MIT, where they love computers. And even at MIT, as Susan has reminded us, they got to actually have face-to-face conversations. Put the computer down, close the darn lid, and have a face-to-face conversation. So if you've got some time this summer, seriously, read Sherry Turkle's book. I think it's just an amazing piece of work. Who's next? What are you going to stop doing?
We'll allow uncomfortable wait time if nobody speaks up here a little bit.
I'm going to stop answering emails on my cell phone because I
God
get
bless
sucked
you.
in and it's like ridiculous. And then I lose track of what I'm doing. So I'm going to schedule my email checking.
Well, and as long as we're on the subject of emails, one of the things that I use is called SaneBox. I'll put this in the chat right now. It's very cheap. SaneBox. And what it does is to separate out all the advertisements and newsletters from email. So like if you email me, I promise you, I will answer you. But if you're sending me like a newsletter or an ad, or because I bought my daughter something at Lululemon 3 years ago, and I'm still getting every day things from Lululemon, I don't want to hear about it. I'll answer your email, but I don't want to see Lululemon in there anymore. So similarly, we've got to be able to screen our emails and not just answer them as they come in. Thank you. That's a great reminder. So I'm not, my intent today is not to put you on the spot, but seriously to say the following. The next time you start a list of what you're going to do, the next time you start a strategic planning process, you must have the not to do list as part of that, because it's really easy to start putting more on the plates of overstressed teachers and administrators. It's much harder to take things off, but you will gain enormous credibility with teachers and with administrators if you'll start by taking things off the plate before you start putting one more thing on. I'm mindful of our time. We've got 30 more minutes and I want to stay right on track here. So here are some other things that I want to make sure that we get done. Part of the guidance that I had from the SST for today's discussion was building a climate of, in another book that I wrote, of fearlessness. And that is, what are we willing to do in order to make a climate of fear, which has certainly been prevalent, not just in the last 2 years, but really longer than that. For many of you, it's been throughout your professional lives, a climate of fear based on what's going to happen to me if I fail, what's going to happen to me if my scores go down, what's going to happen to me if fill in the blank here, to fearlessness. And the context of fearlessness is all about what it turns out to be most essential right now in the spring of 2022. And that is resilience, bouncing back from fear, bouncing back from failure, a climate of fearlessness that allows us to say, okay, so we made some mistakes, so we had some difficulties, so we had some trauma. How do we bounce back from all those things? So one of the things that you and I must do as leaders and as educators and people coaching leaders and educators is how do we create a fearless environment? So again, I'm going to give you a minute of think time, but let me just set this up before I send you back to your 60 seconds. An example of how I know you never intentionally do this, but sometimes that we unintentionally create fearfulness is the expectations of what happens when we watch classrooms. We have instructional coaches, for example, on this call. And man, are we lucky to have you. I love the fact that you have instructional coaches. But I'm the classroom teacher, and I see you walking down the hallway, and I worry about what you're expecting me to do. And I worry that one of the things that I'm supposed to do is to have everything looking perfect. What I really want to do in a fearless environment, not a fearful environment, but a fearless environment, is being able to make mistakes, calling on kids who don't know the answer, and being able to have you watch me even when I don't follow the lesson plan, but maybe stop and make mid-course corrections. This is especially important right now when we have people who think that the only thing teachers ought to do is follow the script. And if you don't follow the script, you might be in trouble. So I want to make sure that I'm asking you in this 60 seconds of think time of what you can do to create a fearless environment. A fearless environment in which I can make a mistake as an adult, My students can make a mistake, and I'm still okay with you as my coach, as my administrator, as my observer. So I'll see you back here in 60 seconds. Tell me what will make for a fearless environment. And back to large group, please, in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And let's start with the chat room. What makes for a fearless environment in the classroom? And by the way, I know some of you work with district level colleagues, so please don't think just in terms of classroom. What makes for a fearless environment in the boardroom as well?
So Dr. Reeves, this is Barb Cockcroft, and I put in the chat to accept people where they are and don't assume that they have all the tools necessary to maximize learning, coach people to success, and I believe there are no failures in life. I used to tell my students the acronym FAIL is first attempt in learning. There's no failures, there's only lessons yet to be learned.
I'm smiling so broadly because literally I was writing about a chapter in a new book about this last night. And you got to help me with this because I am completely struggling with the idea. And here's what I was writing. So this is just like colleague to colleague, a question. So what I started this chapter is, okay, so we all believe in failure. We all, failure is learning. And then I said, but what happens to kids when they fail? When the administrator walks in the room and a kid gives the wrong answer, or what is the expression on the administrator's face? What's the expression on the teacher's face? Is it really what you just said? Oh, that's an opportunity to learn. Or is it disappointment? So coach me. If I were a new teacher or new administrator, coach me on how to accept failure better, because I don't think we're doing a very good job of this.
So when I was in the classroom, and if my students answered something erroneously as the answer I was eliciting, I would say, you know what, I am so appreciative that you jumped right in. And had I asked this question, wow, that would have been the correct Jeopardy answer, is what I would always say. I said, however, let's think about what you said and let's figure out a different perspective, because they were coming from a different angle than the teacher's edition, which I threw that, in the wastebasket on day one, because I didn't care about the right answer. I cared about their answer supported with evidence is what I cared about. So yeah, I feel like in our role as SST9 consultants, we have the privilege of working with administrators, working with teachers, working with curriculum directors. And I mean, my goodness, I've been in education for over 45 years, so I've got a lot of lessons learned, if you will. I could have said failures, but I still don't believe that. I believe they were things I hadn't learned yet. And I always told my students the magic of the word yet.
Yes. So colleagues, you really need to hear what your colleague just said, because honestly, I think that is not the perception that a lot of teachers and a lot of new administrators are hearing right now. They want perfection. They feel under such stress. So we need to hear what you just said. And I love the expressive way and the joyful way in which you said it, that failure is okay. But man, please do not take that for granted. Our teachers and the next generation of administrators, and thanks for your experience, but the next generation has got to hear that, because I worry that they're not hearing that. They think they've got to be perfect, and that insistence upon perfection is not our friend. Thank you so much for your authenticity. So
and
who's
Doug,
next?
I also said your sequel to your PLC Light article should be entitled PLC Right.
Yeah, well said.
That's your sequel. Former English teacher here.
Who's next?
All right, I say Brian writes, lead by example, take calculated risks, and create an inquiry-based mindset.
Would you elaborate on what you mean by risks?
Yeah, this is Brian again. I think as I'm gonna district level administrator. And I think partly, especially when I first started in this position, you want to put out this, I don't know, image that, you know what you're doing, and you know everything, and,
Right.
and you put up this wall and armor, and obviously that works against what you want to do. So I think, when you lead by example, you have to have a certain amount of confidence in yourself to be able to do that. And just say, hey, we're looking at some things. Here's, focus on our purpose. This is what we want to accomplish. What are some ways of doing it? And, you want to, not just jump into things haphazardly, but be willing to, to step out and do some things. And hopefully if they go well, you learn from that. If it doesn't go well, you learn from that too. And I think if, you know, principals and teachers see you doing that, and hopefully they can turn their classroom into a place where they can, sort of do that too, where they're trying things and learning from them and sharing that with others and that sort of thing. So I guess that's what I meant by it.
Well, I really appreciate that. And let me just tell you, you're obviously, a nice guy and an empathetic guy, and I appreciate that. But you scare the crap out of me if I'm a classroom teacher.
Yeah.
So when I hear you say take a risk, what I hear as a first year teacher in your district is, oh my gosh, he's coming to my classroom. So I really need you to help me understand what is an okay risk. And I don't mean a sloppy risk. I don't mean a careless risk, but what is an okay risk for me to take?
I would say one that's, I don't know, purposeful, right? That you've identified a need with your students or something. You've identified something that may purposely isn't working.
Right.
So there's, it's not, we're just going to try something because I read an article about it today, but there's a purpose involved. And you can see that you've thought through different ways of possibly addressing this. And then you try to address it and see if that works. And, you share whether, it's been successful or not successful with your fellow teachers and with, I think purpose to me is.
You're reminding me of a wonderful administrator I've written about that's who's a good friend of mine, Dr. Mike Wasta, who used to send out oopsgrams, and Mike would say, hey, here's a mistake that I made, and here's how we can all learn from it. And so I think from a senior leader like you, when you validate the fact that I can make a mistake, that I can take a risk, as long it's not a careless risk, not a dumb risk, but it's a purposeful risk, as you say. I had a good intent, but it didn't work out. That's the kind of thing that I really need reinforcement on. In fact, back to the earlier question that one of your colleagues raised, that's a really good TBT in Ohio context to do, is what's something that didn't work out. We're so used to sharing our success stories, but a really good TBT or building-based team or district level team share out would be, what's something that we tried, as you just heard, that didn't work, and what can we all learn from that? That's a really courageous thing. Thank you. That was a really thoughtful insight. Who's next?
I just want to chime in. Got some out here, but Brian, I think brings up a great point of this growth mindset, or this inquiry-based mindset, and model that for the teachers. That calculated, hey, we're going to try this together. We're going to try something, and if it fails, but how do we get that continued? When the teachers feel comfortable doing it, then we teach them to do that. The teachers will do it for the kids, and then the kids really will start to feel comfortable. And then when you allow failure, you allow fearlessness to follow, because they don't feel scared to make a wrong answer. So I really appreciate that from Brian.
Yeah, and can I just really, you mentioned growth mindset. Carol Dweck, God bless her, 20 years ago, articulated growth mindset. And I think sometimes people think, well, gee, if it doesn't have a 2022 copyright on it, it must not be new and current. What she did 20 years ago is as vital today as it was 20 years ago. And I just last night was listening to Judd Brewer at Brown University, who is a world-class psychiatrist and child development expert, but honoring what Carol Dweck said, as you just did, on growth mindset. So please don't think that these things from years ago are irrelevant, because what Dr. Dweck did then is as relevant today as it was then. So thanks. That's a great reminder. Anybody else in the chat room before we go to our next subject?
Yeah, Renee writes, true shared leadership helps to develop a fearless culture.
And if you wouldn't mind, Renee, please evaluate or elaborate on what you mean by shared leadership.
Sure. This year in my district at Marlington, we are truly having that district leadership team, the BLTs and the TBTs, and it's just about that honest feedback and that honest communication. So strategically, like you look at the feedback loop, and it's great when you see it on paper. It's great when you see, you know, our SST9 support comes in and shares about it, but seeing it in action is a beautiful thing, where we truly are hearing the voices of our teachers and those decisions that we are making on purpose, with purpose, you know, based upon our one needs plan, but also just we're listening, right? And the direction that we're moving. And it's allowing for our staff collectively as a whole, from our teachers, our support staff, to our building leaders and central office, to be making decisions for the district that has a true shared leadership view. And I think that's a hard thing to do sometimes, you know, especially when you're dabbling into topics that some folks might not be comfortable with. So when you start to create that platform, it allows them, hey, it's okay, we're learning and growing together. And that's one of the things I always say, because like Brian said, and we don't know everything, you know, and that's it. It's okay. So as we learn and grow together, when we know better, we'll do better. And if there's something that we start and we realize there might be a better way to do that, and we've got, you know, collectively agree upon that, then we will move forward in that direction. So it's been a really neat thing to watch this year. It organically happen in the district.
So Renee, this is really a thoughtful and insightful point. And if you don't mind, I want to just ask you to coach me on this. There's a ton of leadership turnover in Ohio. I assume in SST9, I know it's throughout the state. So I'm the new leader, and I kind of intellectually hear what you're saying about shared leadership, but actually I'm the new sheriff in town, and I've got a vision. Here's what I'm going to do. Coach me as a new leader on what I should do to exhibit shared leadership, because a lot of new leaders that we're seeing in Ohio don't get that. So what should I do to show that I really am serious about shared leadership?
Sure. I think it starts with the modeling of, like, so when I plan the district leadership team, it is modeling the example of shared leadership and equity of voice and different activities during that district leadership team. So then that building administrator can then come in and facilitate the same type of activities, the same type of mindset within their own building leadership team. But I also think that comes through coaching. So meeting on a consistent basis with that new administrator and allowing them to share feedback about the meeting personally for them. We also do a plus delta form. I think that's important, so that, you know, that those new administrator to be getting feedback about the processes of their meeting, you know. And I will tell you, one thing we had was when we break out into our small groups, we have goal groups during our district leadership team. One of the pieces of feedback was we have equity of voice in our large group, but sometimes when we break off into our smaller groups, they didn't feel there was as much equity of voice. And so we talked about that during the next DLT. And so, you know, honoring and recognizing what we are saying are our strengths in our areas for growth. And I think, like I said, modeling those practices will help a new instructional leader, right? A new building leader, to hopefully start facilitating those types of things in their own building.
So everybody pay attention to the details of what you just heard. The great meeting is not one in which and let's keep our pronouns really precise here. The great man on the white horse, because it's usually a man on a white horse, you know, in front, is commanding the meeting. What you just heard from your colleague is the opposite. That is breakout groups, thoughtful, collaborative meetings. Stop with the announcements. Stop with the pronouncements. Stop with the "I'm going to tell you what to do," and listen. So, you know, I really think the details of what you just communicated to us all are really important, and we need to hear you really precisely, because the only way that you get, as you, if I understood you correctly, equity of voice, is that the right word? The only way that we're going to get equity of voice is if we really include everybody around us. So let's take what you just said really, really seriously. Thank you. Who's next?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's the same thing I always say. Like, we need to create spaces to check in with one another. You know, administrators need to check in with one another. Administrators need to check in with their teachers and give them that space to build those relationships so they feel vulnerable, so they feel comfortable to have a growth mindset or to fail. Like, when you're new, you need to have that one-on-one time, that small group, the conversations, right? So I just think that that's really, really important, that we're creating those spaces to do this very challenging, hard work together, because what we do in education is the most impactful job on the planet, but it's really, really hard. And we have to make sure that we're intentional about creating those spaces to support one another and cheer one another on and challenge one another as well.
So Colleen, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I really want to learn from this. I think part of what you've said that is so important is we got to make space and time to be with one another. And yet I've been in principals' offices where I've tried to say that, and they say, Doug, you don't understand. You know, I got 2 bus drivers missing. I got subs who don't show up. I've got teachers who are on quarantine. I don't have time for any of that. How do you help me as the administrator do what you just told me to do?
So I think there are always challenges, right? And I, as a former principal, like totally fell into that trap. But what I know now is I would totally do way better and be very intentional. I would get my secretary to, or my administrative assistant, excuse me, to like protect my space and time, that this is really important. I would get them scheduled, and that's would be what I do. And I would have a backup, you know, if there's other things going on, someone else can handle it. Like, I don't have to be the lone decision maker or the problem solver. I am not Olivia Pope, even though I would love to be. You know, like, there are other people who can put out fires unless it's a literal fire, and then you can interrupt me, you know. So just being very intentional and keeping that space sacred, because that's a really important part of our job too.
So everybody listen to what Colleen just said. This is so incredibly important. The people you're supporting and coaching are overwhelmed right now. They're trying to do everything, and yet they still can if they're willing to ask for help. It requires being vulnerable to ask your administrative assistant to say, in fact, I was smiling so broadly because you reminded me of a wonderful principal that I saw who literally, instead of having her to-do book, you know, was in this concealed leather-bound binder, put it on her wall. And everybody who walked in could see, and the admin could say, oh, I can do that. I can do that. A teacher leader, 3rd grade team leader could say, oh, I can do that. I can do that. And they kept taking things off of her list when her perception was, oh, everybody's adding things to my list. Once she was vulnerable, as you're suggesting, that it's okay to show how overwhelmed I am, people could take things off the list. The other reason that you were making me smile so broadly is my first boss told me that the position of the door has nothing to do with the open door policy. That is, you can have your door open metaphorically. That is, people can come in and see me, but it's okay to close the door. It's okay to have some private time. And that never occurred to me without Mr. Burns telling me that it was okay to see that. By the way, I always have to add, whenever I say Mr. Burns, that's not the guy from The Simpsons. That's a real Mr. Burns. So thank you. That was a really thoughtful contribution. I really appreciate that, Colleen. We have time. I'm keeping my mind on the clock here. We have time for one more.
Well, at this time, there's nothing in the chat box. Does anybody else want to share out?
Okay, so just a couple of more things before I turn it back to Susan. First of all, I know that we began this conversation saying this is the last of our discussions for 2022, but it really is not. The last is just the beginning, because part of my commitment to the SST9 team and to ODE is a continuing conversation. I always am willing to, and some of you have already taken me up on this, but I'm going to put it in the chat room again. are willing to have conversations. And I am not ego involved in the size of the audience. You know, it's very, you know, fulfilling to speak to 1,500 administrators for the Ohio Leadership Conference and to the, you know, the Ohio School Board Association, and I've done all that kind of stuff. But let me tell you, I'm not ego involved in that. If the real need is, Doug, you got to speak to my third grade team. You got to speak to this parent group. My board is up in arms about standards-based grading, as some of you mentioned earlier. Seriously, my commitment to you does not end today. My commitment to you continues in the years ahead. I've done all those things. I've been a lucky guy in my life to be able to write a lot of books and do a lot of speeches, but please don't think that what your needs are at your district at the SST level is any less important than any of those big presentations and speeches. So I want you to know that you can call on me. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but you know, like the guy on TV says, I've seen a thing or two. So if I can be supportive of you, I want you to count on me. Most importantly, as I think the SST has done so thoughtfully, is that we have to translate ideas into action. And that is, it's not about the theory. It's not about the administrative commands. I know that you have a ton of things coming down on you from other headquarters, but I want to talk about implementation, and I want to talk about how do we make this stuff real in your buildings and in your classroom. So please, for goodness sake, count on me to do those things. And I'll rely on the SST to share my contact information with all of you, because I really am committed to you, not as the end of our conversations this year, but as the beginning of what I hope will be a long-term relationship. So Susan and SST colleagues, thank you so much for your really thoughtful contributions today and throughout the year. Susan, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Reeves. I don't think we can thank you enough for you know, getting us on this path of this work and guiding us on, you know, how to best do it. And to everyone today for your conversation. I think we really learned from each other and what you're doing. And I think you were all fearless leaders and paving some way. So we will take you up on it to continue the conversations with you and appreciate that for sure. So I'm kind of sad this is our last one. I'm really sad. So, but not our last one, like you said, but we'll keep it going. All right. So with that, I think we are going to get into our breakout rooms and continue to discuss this. So again, thank you, Dr. Reeves, for all of your insight and
My pleasure.
being with us. We appreciate that.
Okay. Take care, everybody.
Yes. Looking forward to the new book. I think that's our next read. Well, we got lots of next reads on our list here. But I think definitely implementation is something where we're all thinking about. All right, Tyler, I think I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, I can pick up from here, Susan. So we are going to do our networking now. This is always a fan favorite where we continue to learn from each other. And you're going to be put into breakout rooms, and we're going to have about 10 minutes in our breakout rooms. And if you would kindly just introduce yourself to one another, select a reporter for the group. We have 3 discussion questions, thinking about what we learned today from each other and from Dr. Reeves. What are some things that you want to implement? What might we stop doing? What might we continue doing? And then we're going to rejoin the whole group for about 10 minutes before we close out of today's session. And once again, if you are watching this with your own respective team, you do not need to join a breakout session. Are there any questions? All right, so here are the questions. Tyler is going to put us into our breakout rooms. Remember, select a reporter, and we're going to have about 10 minutes to be with one another. So thank you very much.